Thank you, Ernestina, for the kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the Institute, the Ministry, Nestle, and the planners for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to be speaking about the global agenda for the prevention of diabetes and focusing on some research opportunities. I'll begin by talking about the global burden of type 2 diabetes and the global costs of type 2 diabetes, and then I'll turn to the research opportunities related to the prevention of type 2 diabetes. So first, what is the global burden of type 2 diabetes? I think, as we all know, the global burden is enormous and it is growing. 4 groups have tried to estimate the number of people with diabetes in the world and to make projections for the future burden of type 2 diabetes. And this slide shows their estimates. As you can see, the number of people globally with diabetes has increased dramatically over the past few decades. And I think another interesting fact is that each progressively more recent estimate, so 1998, 2004, and 2010, has demonstrated the global burden to be greater than estimated previously. If we look at the most recent study that has estimated the global burden of diabetes, it has estimated that between 2010 and 2030, the number of adults with diabetes worldwide will increase 54%, from 285 million to 439 million. Developed countries will experience a 20% increase in the number of people with diabetes, including a 20% increase in Europe, 42% in North America, and 47% in the Western Pacific. Most of the burden of diabetes in the future will occur in developing countries. They will experience a 69% increase, with a 65% increase in South and Central America, 72% in Asia, 94% in the Middle East, and 98% in Africa. The sad news is that these are conservative estimates. They probably underestimate the future burden of type 2 diabetes. And it's important to note that this burden will occur more in developing countries than developed countries, and as you've just heard, it will be more in the middle-aged population than the older population, so the working population, the productive population, will be disproportionately affected. This epidemic will have major implications for future costs. It's been estimated that in 2010, the global cost of diabetes was $376 billion, or 12% of all health care costs. 95% of global health expenditures for diabetes were from the world's richest countries. So 57% of all of the money spent for diabetes care in the world was spent in North America, 28% in Europe, and 10% in the Western Pacific. This slide shows the mean annual health expenditures per person with diabetes by region in 2010, and the results are expressed in US dollars. In North America, the average annual expenditures per person with diabetes were $5,700. In Southeast Asia, it was $53, a 100-fold difference in expenditures for diabetes across the world. This slide depicts the expenditures for diabetes by development status and type of expenditures. Obviously, in developed countries, more money is spent for diabetes compared to developing countries. A lot of money is spent on anti-hyperglycemic therapy in developed countries, but even more money is spent on the treatment of complications. in developing countries, less money is spent. A larger proportion goes for treating diabetes itself, and less goes to treating complications. The problem will be that as countries develop, more money will need to be spent on treating diabetes, and more money will need to be spent on treating diabetic complications. It's been estimated that by 2030, the global cost of diabetes will increase by 30% from about $376 billion US to $490 billion US. And again, like the other estimates, these are very conservative estimates, assuming that per capita healthcare expenditures for diabetes will not increase, and we know that that is not the case. As we observed with respect to the burden of diabetes, developed countries are projected to have a smaller increase, a 27% increase in expenditures for diabetes, and most of the increasing costs for diabetes will be in developing countries. They will experience a 67% increase in expenditures for diabetes. There are a number of reasons for the increasing burden and the increasing costs of diabetes. Certainly population growth, aging of the population, and changing of population demographics with increasing trends in urbanization and adoption of a Western diet with increased calories and less physical activity. In addition, there's an increased incidence of diabetes, which is contributing to the increased prevalence. The changing criteria for the diagnosis of diabetes have also led more people to be diagnosed. And some of these things are actually not bad in terms of increasing costs. Increasing costs are also related to increased access to care and decreased diabetes mortality related to better care. An important and very sobering fact, though, is that economic development will be associated with an increase in per capita healthcare expenditures. This slide illustrates this, and it shows end-stage renal disease or kidney failure treatment rates by national economic wealth. The y-axis, this axis shows end-stage renal disease treatment rates per million population, and the x-axis shows the gross domestic product per capita in US dollars. This dashed line represents the gross domestic product, distinguishing low and middle income countries from high income countries. And as you can see, in low and middle income countries, rates of end-stage renal disease treatment are low. It's not that people are not developing end-stage renal disease, they are not being treated. In developed countries, end-stage renal disease treatment rates are substantially higher, and the problem is that as countries develop, more people will be treated for the end-stage complications at a huge financial burden. And I would argue that the projected increase in healthcare costs attributable to diabetes and its complications will be unsustainable in the future. This has the potential to bankrupt national treasuries. So what can be done? What is the efficacy of interventions to delay or prevent the development of diabetes? The evidence base for diabetes prevention is probably one of the strongest and most consistent in medicine. A number of trials have demonstrated that lifestyle interventions designed to achieve about a 5 to 7% loss in initial body weight associated with an increase in moderate physical activity can reduce the risk of diabetes by 29 to 58%. Similarly, metformin treatment can reduce the risk by 26% to 31%. The alpha-glucosidase inhibitors can reduce the risk by 25 to 41%, and the thiazolidine diones by 55% to 72%. So I think the major research opportunity now is to translate the findings of these randomized controlled clinical trials into clinical care. And the question is, can lifestyle interventions be translated into practice? I think this is a very important area for research, and there has been research looking at observational follow-up to the clinical trials, primary care-based interventions, and community interventions. 3 of the 4 large clinical trials of lifestyle interventions included observational follow-up, and the good news is that all of these interventions had persistent beneficial effects for up to 20 years, reducing the risk of the development of type 2 diabetes. The effort has been made now to translate these into primary care, and this summarizes some of the studies that have been reported looking at that. There are 3 things to note, I think, from this slide. First is that in each instance, in trying to take these interventions into primary care, there's been an effort to reduce resource utilization and to do more with remote support by phone or email, or even using DVDs. The second thing is that rather than look at diabetes prevention, these studies have looked at percent weight loss, which is a proxy measure for diabetes prevention. And the third and probably most concerning factor is that all of these studies have had a short time horizon relative to the timeline for developing diabetes. Nevertheless, the results have been encouraging in that there is a reduction, at least in body weight, that seems to be sustained for up to 2 years. These interventions have also been translated into community organizations. The YMCAs are nonprofit community organizations that really focus on healthy lifestyle. YMCAs in the U.S. have adapted the diabetes prevention program and implemented the interventions primarily to high-motivated individuals. They show, though, that in this setting, for people who are highly motivated to participate, lifestyle interventions can cause weight loss consistent with that of the diabetes prevention program, and that these effects can be sustained for up to 2 years. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the U.S. has taken on diabetes prevention as a major initiative through the Division of Diabetes Translation, and they have developed a nationwide program to try to train the workforce to deliver diabetes prevention interventions, to ensure quality of the programs by having a recognition program or a certification for effective programs. They've tried to develop intervention sites in different settings to deliver the program, and are trying to market the programs to support program uptake. They're also beginning to try to get insurers or payers for health care to support these programs. So I think the major challenge is to translate diabetes prevention into clinical practice. There are a number of other areas, though, that I think are very important to address with research in order to see how best these interventions can be implemented. And they involve case finding who should be intervened on, trying to promote uptake and adherence to the interventions, trying to ensure adequate funding and sustainability, and also looking towards implementing pharmacologic treatments. So case finding has been a major issue. Identifying the at-risk individuals has been a barrier to translation of diabetes prevention. And one major beneficial fact has been that the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which is a national organization that rates the strength of evidence for interventions in medicine, has issued a draft recommendation recommending screening for abnormal glucose tolerance and type 2 diabetes. With this, then, people will be screened more frequently in clinical practice, and people with prediabetes are more likely to be identified. In addition, this recommendation was given an evidence level B, and under the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare in the U.S., health plans must pay for interventions that have an evidence level of A or B given by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. So this should help find people who could benefit from diabetes prevention. Everyone loves to screen for diabetes and prediabetes, and I would also argue, though, that we have a lot of information about people that can be used to identify at-risk individuals. And we believe that applying mathematical models to large existing health plan data sets may be a practical and inexpensive way to identify patients with impaired fasting glucose or impaired glucose tolerance for intervention. And we looked at data from two large health plans, one in the Midwest and one on the West Coast, with 700,000 and 3.3 million members, and looked at adults who did not have diabetes but had adequate health plan electronic data to identify at-risk individuals. And we developed a series of models that we applied to those existing data that used progressively more complete data about the individual, including age, what diagnoses they had, whether they had medications prescribed, and so forth. And using those data, we were able to develop a series of algorithms that identified people with impaired fasting glucose or impaired glucose tolerance. Older age and being a man were consistent predictors of having prediabetes, as were one or more indicators of body size, so obesity or actually measured BMI, having high blood pressure, and having dyslipidemia or hypercholesterolemia. And these could be measured with very basic data or more sophisticated clinical biometric data. And these models actually were very effective at identifying a relatively small proportion of people who had prediabetes, but they were very specific. So in other words, they did not misclassify people who did not have prediabetes as having prediabetes. And so I think algorithms like this may be very useful if they can be applied to existing databases to find people who can benefit from diabetes prevention. The next issue is uptake and adherence, and the question is how to get people to participate in these programs. The YMCA programs and the National Diabetes Prevention Program generally recruit interested and motivated volunteers. How can we get less interested people to participate in these programs, and can these programs be integrated into mainstream medical care? Here, I think research focusing on behavioral economics will be very important. And there are a number of strategies that have been considered. One is to simply reduce or eliminate out-of-pocket costs so that people have access to these programs without any barrier in terms of cost. Some have even argued that people should be paid to participate in these programs if they are at high risk. And another strategy is loss avoidance. People don't like having money or benefits taken away from them, and I believe that loss avoidance can be a powerful motivator for participation in these programs. We pilot tested a program using loss avoidance that was incorporated into an insurance program in southeastern Michigan. And about 70,000 people enrolled in this insurance program, which provides strong incentives for patients, providers, and employers to improve their health. People who elect this health program have to complete a qualification form, agree to adopt a healthy lifestyle, and work to achieve their wellness plans. People who adhere to their wellness plans actually receive extra benefits through their health insurance, and pay less for their health insurance. And for the average person, this amounts to a saving of about $800 US per member per year. This insurance program also provides physicians and employers who pay for the insurance a 10% reduction in their premiums and increased payments to the physicians. And in this program, beginning in 2009, overweight and obese participants were required to participate in a weight management program, in other words, to lose weight. There were 3 programs that they could choose from. One was the weight management program, which was a very intensive behavioral weight management program that incorporated very low-calorie diets. The others were less rigorous programs, Weight Watchers, which is a commercial program that provides weekly structured in-person counseling. And the third was Walking Spree, which is a pedometer-based walking program that people need to participate in. To maintain enhanced benefits, people had to enroll in one of these programs and to continue participation. And what we found with this program was that by using this motivation, participation rates were high, about 90%, in unselected obese insurance, health insurance enrollees, and adherence was excellent at 1 year. More than 70% of people stayed in the programs. There was a reduction in BMI for all participants who participated in a program and improved cardiovascular risk control. And even though these programs did not save money, they reduced the increase in costs relative to the costs that were seen among people who did not participate in any of these programs. So I think behavioral economic approaches invoking loss avoidance may promote uptake and adherence to lifestyle interventions within the mainstream healthcare delivery system and should be an area for active research. Another issue relates to funding and sustainability. There's a lack of available programs, and this is a barrier to diabetes prevention, and lack of funding is a barrier to implementation and maintenance of these programs. So once again, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has come to our rescue because this year in 2014, they found that for adults who are overweight or obese and have additional cardiovascular risk factors, including pre-diabetes, intensive behavioral counseling interventions to promote diet and physical activity are indicated for CVD prevention. This too was given an evidence level of B, so these sorts of programs now will become available to people who are insured in the U.S., and this should actually help to ensure their availability and sustainability. The final issue I want to talk about is pharmacologic therapy. And despite the fact that pharmacologic therapy has been shown to be effective for diabetes prevention, it has not received much traction or attention. These are data from the Diabetes Prevention Program that look at the reduction in diabetes risk associated with the lifestyle intervention, metformin, or placebo by age. And certainly in people 24 to 44 years of age, metformin is as effective as lifestyle intervention. And for more middle-aged people, metformin, though not as effective, is still effective for diabetes prevention. So the question is, why has not metformin been more widely adopted for diabetes prevention? These are data from the same 2 health plans I referred to earlier that show that only about 4% of people in the Midwestern health plan who had prediabetes were actually receiving metformin, And in the California health plan, essentially zero, only 28 out of 50,000 people with diagnosed prediabetes were being treated with metformin. So what's the problem? I think one is that providers have not endorsed metformin or other medications for diabetes prevention, and the other is marketing. Part of the problem is that none of these treatments is approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for diabetes prevention, but I think physicians could do more to promote these medications for diabetes prevention. And I think the lack of marketing by large pharmaceutical companies has also resulted in these very effective treatments not being more widely applied, and I think this is an opportunity as well for more research to see how these treatments can be appropriately applied. So, in conclusion, lifestyle interventions for preventing diabetes are effective, very effective in young and old, in women and men, in all racial and ethnic groups. They work in less obese and more obese people, and people who are less and more hyperglycemic. They're associated with improved health-related quality of life. They're safe, and we have demonstrated, at least in the U.S., that they are very cost-effective. The effectiveness, cost-effectiveness, and appropriateness of lifestyle interventions for diabetes prevention should not negate the importance, however, of integrating lifestyle interventions into mainstream medical care. I think we need to figure out how to incorporate these into medical practice at the primary care level. I think research needs to focus on approaches to pharmacotherapy for at-risk patients, and none of this diminishes the importance of societal interventions to address school health, food policy, and the built environment. In addition, as we heard in the first talk, early detection and intensive management of diabetes are critically important for those who have developed diabetes. So I think research must focus on how best to implement diabetes prevention in diverse populations and settings. Thank you.